So welcome back to our symposium. We're back to follow on our conversations. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Sanchez, and I was another Meyer Curatorial Fellow, the first one, the oldest one. And I was here working with Ethan in the Philosophy Chamber in the research and the planning of the exhibition from 2014 to 2016. And I am currently working at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow University, where we will host the Philosophy Chamber show in March next year, and we can wait for that. So now, without further ado, we will move on to our last panel of the day, virtual rooms. And for this panel, we have an exceptional selection of papers that will focus on a range of strategies, visualizing, recreating, and simulating to transform the space of the room into a different reality. So we will have Nicholas Robbins, Ph.D. student at the Department of History of Art at Yale University, who will talk about Paul Nelson's surgical theater at the Cité Hospitalière de Lille. We have also Sarah Ann Carter, curator and director of research at the Chipstone Foundation, who will invite us to visit Mrs. M's cabinet and reflect on period room as pedagogy. And finally, we'll have Chad Randall, visiting lecturer in architecture at University of Oregon, who will fly us to the sky with his bedroom aviator, flight simulations, and domestic realm. Please welcome our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Lola. And thank you to everyone who's contributed to today's wonderful conversations, and to Laura and Ethan for inviting me. Okay. 2 years before the architect Paul Nelson was born in Chicago, Thomas Eakins exhibited his paintings, The Gross Clinic and the Agnew Clinic, at that city's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Eakins's paintings celebrated surgery's ascendance within both medical and popular culture as a paradigmatically modern, rational practice, rather than a barbarous measure of last resort. Apprehended upon their exhibition not as a celebration of medical prowess, but instead as, quote, ghastly symphonies in gore and bitumen, their intended significance shifted dramatically when encountered outside the spaces of the medical profession. Perhaps this was due, in part, to their unsettling insistence on the presence of bodies, on their fleshiness and capacity for touch, sensation, and pain. The perspectival systems of both works collapses the distance between surgery and spectator. The wall of intently watching faces seated in the banked surgical amphitheater forms an unsettlingly proximate corporeal backdrop to the instructive scene. Compare Eakins's Agnew Clinic, then, with illustrations of a surgical theater published 40 years later in the fall 1933 issue of the journal L'Architecture Vivante. At right, we see two surgeons in the center, swathed in white, glowing under the intense, mirror-enhanced artificial light emanating from above, and leaning over a body barely visible under yet more blanched fabric. They seem not to touch, but rather to look, as do the two female aides standing slightly back. The room is otherwise empty. The illustration at left, two male faces press up close to a surface, a screen upon which the image of the surgery is being projected in an adjacent room. The tangled tissues of the surgical site are shown glowing, weightless, and detached from the body to which they belong, akin to a page in an anatomical textbook. L'Architecture Vivante ascribed authorship of these illustrations not to an architect, but to the surgeon Oscar Lambré, professor of clinical surgery at Lille. But they formed part of a longer collaboration in the early 1930s between Paul Nelson, doctors, and scientists to propose a new model for medical architecture, the Cité Hospitalière de Lille. This was Nelson's most ambitious project to date and followed upon his early interests in medicine while a student at the École des Beaux-Arts and in the atelier of Auguste Perret. And I should note, due to the aerial nature of the airplane, that he was actually a fighter pilot in World War I, and that's how he ended up in France. The massive complex at Lille was never built, but the plans were published in a large volume by Cahiers d'Art in 1933, a book which stands autonomously as a manifesto for what Nelson called a new, quote, technological architecture, of which its surgical chamber was exemplary. Nelson's plans, published in this volume, provide an opportunity to consider the ways in which surgery reconfigured conceptions of architectural space and its relationship to technology, vision, and the human body. In his designs for Lille's operating theater, we move from the corporeal space of the amphitheater to a surgical theater for the age of cinema, a world of images and fragments defined like surgery by the action of the cut. Architectural space is reconceived to produce the hyper-visibility of the surgical site, now excised and projected from the body. Since Foucault's The Birth of the Clinic, vision and the convergence of seeing and knowing have been central to critical histories of medical practice, with the hospital as a key intersection of architecture and biopolitics. Nelson's design represents a shift in which architecture itself has usurped the agency of the surgeon, delivering up the body of the patient not for physical but for visual inspection, and performing the operations of fragmentation and individuation central to what was called the medical gaze. Nelson's design follows on a longer tradition of medical architecture's central role in defining the environmental agency of architectural space. In the 19th century, the development of pavilion-plan hospitals, a version of which you can see on the left, and other new models of spatial organization promoted the delivery of fresh air and light to patients. Such models of architecture, based on miasmatic theories of disease, did not end after the contested acceptance of germ theory and the introduction of antiseptic chemicals to surgical practice. Indeed, the hygienic concerns of medical reform in the 19th century, light, air, cleanliness, became central to the ideologies of much of modern architecture in the 20th. As Beatrice Colomina writes, quote, modern architecture was unproblematically understood as a kind of medical equipment, a mechanism for protecting and enhancing the body. Buildings such as hospitals and tuberculosis sanatoria, you can see Alvar Aalto's Pai Mayo Sanatorium on the right, became models for designing domestic space, with the house reformulated as a machine for living along the lines of the machine for healing that was the hospital. Surgery, with its emphasis on antiseptic purity and minute precision, represented a limit case of medical practice's relationship to architectural space. A writer for Architects Journal in 1925 claimed that, quote, the modern hospital is a triumph of the elimination of the detrimental and the unessential. Because of its absolute fitness to purpose, its operation theater, like the engine room of an ocean liner, is one of the most perfect rooms in the world. Nelson, in collaboration with Lambré, set out to design just such a perfect room at Lille. In his project for the Cité Hospitalière, the model for which we can see here in a photograph taken by Man Ray and published in the book, Nelson was tasked with unifying all the functions of medical treatment at Lille and the surrounding region into one quasi-metropolis, one, quote, organism, as Nelson refers to it in his introduction to the volume. The medical center, which combined hospital and medical school in one, was at its center, and that's the building on the right, the skyscraper. The key challenge of integrating all of these functions, as Christian Zervos writes in the introduction to the volume, was the need to, quote, ensure the isolation of the patients, controlling the passage of the students through space, and preserving the character of autonomy, unquote, of each medical practice, a means of orchestrating the mobility of bodies and disciplines through clinical space. Nelson placed great weight upon the hybrid section and diagram of the medical center that is reproduced at the beginning of the book, which provides an overview of the relationships and adjacencies of the center's many functions. The plan of the building, in diagrammatic form, comes to represent the totality of medical practice and suggests that the building itself, by sheer force of its program, carries out the center's functions of healing, knowledge production, and training. In the almost dizzyingly detailed array of plans that follow, there are a few cases in which sections of his design are pulled out for axonometric representation. The operating suite was one such case, seen in this colored and annotated rendering. Here, we find a hospital devoid of the human body, either that of the surgeon or the patient. Instead of the gore and bitumen of Eakins' canvases, Nelson presents a linear vision of diagrammatic mechanical space, replete with positions in which the human body can be inserted, centered on the surgical beds highlighted in white. The two surgical rooms are surrounded by a sequence of spaces that support the building's production of antiseptic and anesthetic conditions: a sterilization chamber, a wash-up room, and out of sight, a, quote, central gas room that pipes the anesthetics into the room. Situated between the surgical rooms is a cinematic classroom with 5 rows of swiveling red cushioned chairs called the, quote, episcopic room, borrowing a term from microscopy to denote an image produced by reflected light. On either side of the room, 2 screens receive a projected image from the apparatus that hangs above the beds in the adjacent rooms, which serve both as a source of illumination and as a projector of the image of the body below. A loudspeaker amplifies the surgeon's instructions and comments. Nelson's use of axonometric perspective places his work in dialogue with figures in the interwar avant-garde, such as Theo van Doesburg and L. Lissitzky, whose use of axonometry a decade earlier was intended to challenge the fixed anthropomorphic space of linear perspective, the domain of Eakins' paintings, and replace it with a reversible projection extending from either side of the image surface. Nelson's axonometric representation of his surgical theater emphasizes this spatial virtuality, presenting the episcopic room as a space in which projection decorporealizes both the body of the surgical subject and the body of the student spectator. The presentation of the surgical act as a screen image serves an evident medical purpose, maintaining the building's total antisepsis by eliminating the students from the surgical room. Indeed, the patients and the students enter the space from entirely isolated corridors. This spatial isolation separates, while conflating, 2 discrete acts of looking, that of the surgeon and that of the student. The projector provides the student with a surgeon's eye view of the procedure, but one that has been converted into an image, flat and mobile and disarticulated from the totality of the patient's body. Nelson had a background in cinema, having designed a set for the Gloria Swanson vehicle, What a Widow, as well as a private cinema for Joseph Kennedy in 1930, which was never built. The cinematic remediation of the body in this case happens in real time. The projection and screen convert the ongoing material reality of the surgical procedure into visual information. Here, architectural agency permits the medical gaze, as Foucault describes it, to, quote, circulate within an enclosed space in which it is controlled only by itself. Nelson's surgical theater almost diagrams this disciplining and distributing of vision, converting the terms of clinical perception into the structure of architectural space. This layer of virtual remediation distinguishes Nelson's design from other contemporary reconsiderations of the surgical theater. On the right, we see the observation room of an operating theater at James Gamble Rogers New York Medical Center, a project that had been a model for Nelson's Cité Hospitalière, in which students are seated above the surgical table, their vision trained through magnifying lenses upon the operation below the skylight, disciplined and distant, to be certain, yet retaining a sense of corporeal access to the space of operation. The projection and production of knowledge below the episcopic room is supported procedurally and physically by the presence of a small laboratory below, the second room joining both surgical chambers. And he's actually sort of operated upon the image so that you can see below here the laboratory. Here, samples collected from the surgical body can be examined under the microscope directly upon their removal from the patient's body. The results of this examination, we are told, can be immediately projected upstairs for the benefit of the students. In this reconfiguration of medical space, Nelson's design constructs a circuit between surgical, laboratory, and pedagogical spaces, isolating them while initiating a frictionless visual and material communication between each space and affecting the passage of the subject from body to tissue sample to image. The production of knowledge was central to Nelson's conception of the future of medicine. In an address he gave to the Paris International Congress on Hygiene in 1933, the same year his plans for Lille were published, he described a vision for the system of medical centers for France, administered by the state, whose central filing system could retain copies of tests and procedures undergone at each site, a, quote, living medical record and source of information for scholars and statisticians, as well as references for the needs of public, military, and judicial services. As the accompanying diagram from his lecture, which is up there, shows, this system was designed to segregate but capture both healthy and sick bodies, a total national register of medicine that produces subjects visible not only to science, but also to the state at large. The surgical theater at Lille was imagined as just one of the many sites in which this registration and conversion of bodies into knowledge could occur. In the space of Nelson's surgical theater, this conversion does not lack a material register. Despite the putative transformation of the body into episcopic light, the tissues of the body partake instead of the materiality of the room itself, projected through and upon its substance, as seen here in the illustration, where the student's proximity to the screen wall suggests that they wish to touch this image, turned inside out in order to merge with the surface. Here we remember the name of the journal in which this illustration was published, L'Architecture Vivante, Living Architecture. Following the non-realization of his ambitious plans at Lille, Nelson continued to pursue the perfection of medical and surgical space with an architectural vocabulary in which space itself takes on an organic and biological being. In his designs for a hospital at Saint-Lô in Normandy, completed in 1956, he realized many of his plans for the Cité Hospitalière, but radically rethought the form of surgical space, this time not as a room for teaching, but as a self-contained entity. The walls of the ovoid surgical room are inset with an array of lights that could be individually controlled to produce the perfect lighting conditions. The surgical chamber here takes on the qualities of an ideal organ, visible at all points, bounded by smooth, curved antiseptic surfaces, served by a sophisticated climate control system maintaining temperature and circulation of air. It is a vision in which the medical body has been replaced by the body of architecture, organic, self-perpetuating, and purifying, and perfectly visible to itself. Thank you.
Before I begin, I want to thank my co-panelists, Ethan, Laura, and of course Heather, for wonderful organizing this weekend. I'm so happy to be here, and it's been so wonderful to learn from all of you. Mrs. M's Cabinet, and can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Mrs. M's Cabinet is an exhibition, teaching, and research project created by the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the Milwaukee Art Museum. Chipstone is a private foundation, shown here, based in Wisconsin, devoted to the study of decorative arts, material culture, and innovative museum practice. And we've partnered with the Milwaukee Art Museum to create more than 40 exhibitions since 1999. Mrs. M's Cabinet emerged as a curatorial strategy as one of these exhibitions, with a series of goals. First, we wanted to present Chipstone's world-class collection of 17th century ceramics to the general public in a new and engaging way. Next, we wanted to rethink the history of museum display strategies, particularly the period room. And finally, to consider the place of narrative, curatorial authority, which I feel like we're always trying to give up and which we struggle with in various ways, and collaboration in the modern museum gallery. The cabinet, shown here, engages with the tropes of the historic period room, with the goal of offering new possibilities for authorship, interpretation, and participation in the museum. To do this, we created the character of Mrs. M, a late 19th century collector with a rich inner life and a clear point of view about the past. Our team then projected this interiority through the design of her gallery, her cabinet. Mrs. M is a composite character based on interdisciplinary research. She is, in a sense, a set of ideas, an intellectual vehicle through which participants may explore the historic possibilities of period rooms and the ways museums make meaning out of objects more broadly. The expansiveness of Mrs. M's character has allowed for varied modes of interpretation, inviting collaboration. In my graduate seminar, Curating Mrs. M's World, my students investigated her story, her organizing principles, what may be termed the category of Mrs. M, to create new installations for 7 historic objects, which I chose from our collection. My students thought not only about the art historical arguments they hoped to make, but how they could make a meaningful argument through Mrs. M's worldview and space. My brief talk today offers the ongoing Mrs. M's Cabinet project as a case study for investigating the interpretive and scholarly possibilities opened up by viewing a period room not as a static space depicting just one moment, but as a set of intellectual problems and pedagogical possibilities. So, who is Mrs. M? Mrs. M's Cabinet is centered on the story of an imagined female collector who amassed a remarkable group of international 17th century ceramics that may be traced archaeologically to early America. This narrative reflects the archaeological research of the Jamestown Rediscovery Project, a project which has really inspired Chipstone's collection over the past several years, which has allowed us to expand our collecting interests from collecting objects that were made in England or America to collecting a much broader range of objects that have an archaeological precedent in early America. So we can collect objects that are from various European countries, from Asia, from North Africa, et cetera, because they have evidence of being used in North America. And Mrs. M shares these collecting interests. As her story develops, visitors learn that she is a scholar, a collector of great taste, and a bit of a mystery. She passes between cultures and places, gathering objects and building a collection in her fine home. In her biography, which spans a childhood spent mudlarking for ceramic fragments along the James River in Virginia, to studying history, and confronting what she felt was a rather limited and narrow vision of American history presented at the Centennial exhibition, shaped her intellectual world and helped her understand the cosmopolitan nature of material life in early America. She presents her collection of worldly 17th century things in an interior that represents the best cosmopolitan styles of the late 19th century as well. So 17th century cosmopolitan things in a late 19th century cosmopolitan interior. The space, designed by Brent Budsberg and Shana McCaw, 2 artists and designers with whom we work, through their work, her cabinet is as beautiful and full of wonder as it is intellectually dense. Mrs. M, for example, hangs Ojibwe snowshoes, which I should say here at Harvard is a nod to 2 snowshoes hanging on the wall of the Artemis Ward House, a Harvard museum. She hangs these on the wall across from a painting of the Hongs of Canton, not too far away from illustrious Hispano-Moorish porringer. These very international cosmopolitan objects. She presents a view of 17th century America from her world in the late 19th century that challenges visitors to consider how history is narrated in the 21st century in our museums. And in a way, this approach allows Mrs. M to short-circuit historical expectations grounded in the American colonial revival, period of late 19th century museum building that still impacts the ways a lot of our institutions look, and opens up new historical possibilities. So what kinds of interpretations does her cabinet make possible? Well, still somewhat controversially, in Mrs. M's cabinet, we have avoided all traditional museum labels. Anything that suggests a 21st century museum has been excised. Mrs. M is introduced to her visitors in a miniature scale Pepper's Ghost illusion in space, with a video projected inside of a paper doll house, not unlike this maquette from Harvard's collections. So you'd come in, pull this golden cord, and in this film, she offers a synopsis of her biography, and also directly questions visitors to reflect on the presentation of US history in museums. She asks, what is America? Where is America? Who is America? Is it a place? Is it an idea? Is it a set of beliefs that unites people from different backgrounds? So she's asking these questions directly as Mrs. M inside of this Pepper's Ghost illusion projected in her cabinet. And for more than a century, those of us who study period rooms know, most creators of period rooms have really sidestepped these kinds of deeper interpretive questions about what the meanings of these spaces are, preferring to focus on a particular style, a particular moment, a particular place as the real meaning of period rooms. And period rooms that do that often have the power to present seamless, seductive visions of the past. Seamless and seductive because they present plausible, domestically skilled spaces that you imagine you can just walk into, be part of, that often uncritically present a very particular vision of the past. And in effect, these historic interiors may present compelling fictions about the past that really quite uncritically reflect outdated visions of exclusive historical narratives. Well, Mrs. M chooses to place her cabinet very much in contrast to these sorts of outdated historical narratives, explicitly bringing up the 1876 Centennial Exhibition, explicitly referencing things like the New England kitchen, to challenge these fictionalized visions of early American history, visions that only seem to acknowledge very limited cultural influences on early America, limitations she wishes to challenge through her collecting, through the evidence that we, as scholars, know is there in the objects that were historically present in early America. So through her Pepper's Ghost interactive, she's actively positioning herself as the curator of her cabinet, the curator of her cabinet that makes an argument about the past and its relationship to the present. Each aspect of Mrs. M's cabinet conveys a deliberate aesthetic and historic choice that makes her story possible. It is not simply to design an historic interior, but to develop a character in a way that takes seriously this late 19th century notion that interiors, this notion of interiority, that your interior actually is reflecting the person who created it. And this is something that many scholars have written about and thought a lot about. To further this effect, we decided to select the sophisticated and quite cosmopolitan McKim White designed Isaac Bell House in Newport, Rhode Island, which dates to the early 1880s, as a model for her cabinet, taking some of the details from this house as a way to create a late 19th century cosmopolitan home for her 17th century cosmopolitan things. The overall cabinet design really mirrors this cosmopolitan nature of her collecting interests. And without barriers to entry, the space is one that is to be used. We invite you to have a seat in her Cromwellian chair. It's a reproduction in this case. The lighting, everything in this space is one that is inviting you in to sit down, to read some of her books, to explore the space. And there are no hints of a larger 21st century infrastructure. And those of you who work in museums will appreciate this. After a great deal of convincing, even the fire alarms were hidden in this space, right? It's a space that was challenging to get the entire museum on board with this idea that we cannot break character in Mrs. M's cabinet. This is her cabinet. It is not our 21st century cabinet. Her cabinet also explicitly employs historic interpretive strategies to present the objects in her gallery, and at the same time, contests and complicates those strategies by using them to create a fuller picture of the past. All of the ways visitors engage with the 17th century, and just some of the books that we have in the space, all of the ways that visitors engage with the 17th century museum objects in the space align with historic modes of interacting with interiors. In addition to the Pepper's Ghost illusion, through which Mrs. M introduces herself and which is referencing theatrical history, all of the labels and additional text in her ledger book shown here, or her scrapbook elsewhere in the space, which are alternative labeling strategies also accessible online, are handwritten by a local calligrapher who is the hand of Mrs. M. The text here is in Mrs. M's voice, not that of a modern curator. Along with watercolor sketches of each item, which we worked with an artist to create these watercolor sketches, the ledger notes that a particular dish might be Ottoman, not Turkish, describes objects as a careful collector might, a Spanish charger with a pensive young man around 1650, or a remarkably tiny Chinese porcelain wine cup, such a precious thing to be part of such a hard life in 17th century Jamestown, Virginia, where wine cups like that were found. As such, the objects are given a fuller life by understanding them in relation to a person who valued them, something that doesn't often happen in museum collections. Mrs. M's research on ceramics found in Jamestown, Virginia, helps her make the rhetorical claim that she presents about material diversity in early America, as well as a larger point about the importance of object-based epistemology as a key way to understand how objects have been used to make arguments about the world historically. And you can access all of this online, should you be so inclined. Mrs. M didn't have this opportunity, but we do. The basic purpose of Mrs. M's cabinet is to present and interpret historic objects in a manner that more actively considers meaning and cultural complexity. In the cabinet, things inhabit three different historical moments: the moment they were created, the moment she chose to collect and or display them, and of course, the present. And this chronological layering emphasizes the ways all of the objects on display in museums have their own biographies and are in effect time travelers. Like every other object in the museum, the things in this gallery were saved because of the choices people made about their cultural, historical, or aesthetic value at different moments. And her scrapbook, shown here, includes a range of 19th century sources that visitors may page through to understand how Mrs. M accessed and studied this history. Overall, the gallery operates on the conceit that Mrs. M exists. She's present in the Pepper's Ghost illusion, in the notes in her scrapbook, in her ledger, as well as in the design of the room and the intellectual contents of her collection. These clues establish a few principles about her character, particularly her historical context and how she uses the world. We learn that she uses objects as evidence. She questions authority. She is both adventurous and empathetic. And we look to historic examples like U.S. textbook author Mary Sheldon Barnes, Alice Baker of Deerfield, U.S. historian of decorative arts Alice Morse Early, and others to help us ground Mrs. M in this late 19th century context. But she is in her cabinet especially present in her ongoing work. Visitors may peer in on her research left sitting on her desk, piercing the fourth wall of the exhibition by showing her work in progress. The hope is that these approaches make visitors more aware of the subjective nature of her display and others, past and present, in period rooms and throughout the larger museum in which this cabinet is located, thinking about relationships among material things, curatorial perspectives, and visitor experiences. So what kind of pedagogy does this cabinet make possible? The expansiveness and curiosity of Mrs. M's character allows for varied modes of interpretation, which really invite collaboration. Last fall, my graduate seminar, Curating Mrs. M's World at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, in that seminar, my students investigated her story, her organizing principles, what may be termed the category of Mrs. M, to create new installations for 7 historic objects chosen from the collection. They thought not only about the art historical arguments they hoped to make, but how they could make a meaningful claim through Mrs. M's worldview. And then they had the additional stakes of knowing these objects would be on display in a big public museum, in the Milwaukee Art Museum. So they really had to do a good job, which thankfully they did. For example, one of my students used the language of the flowers to critique a vase which was intended to celebrate the centennial in 1876, something that it was hard for them to imagine Mrs. M would really want to celebrate. So we put together a bouquet, presenting it with sunflowers that may stand in for false riches, thornapple for deceitful charms, and scarlet geranium for stupidity, thinking about a veiled way this object might be critiqued in the context of her space. Other installations emphasized her ingenuity, suggesting she certainly would have employed the latest X-ray technology in the late 19th century to study something like an African-American memory jug, or to approach something like a puzzle jug, basically an historic drinking game, as an opportunity for a schematic drawing, thinking about how liquid actually moved through this strange and rather tricky vessel, as well as many other collaborations I don't have time to talk about today, including artist collaborations. The students built upon these stories through her log, through which they were able to talk about and write about what they were doing online for visitors to be able to read. They also were able to write about this and share this through the Milwaukee Art Museum's more public blog. And we also created a video, which if you're curious, you can check out on Chipstone's Art Babble page, in which my students talk about these interventions and what they're trying to accomplish by curating with Mrs. M. In the gallery, her calling cards, which you can pick up, invite visitors to connect with all the material online, to read the log, or even, should you wish, to download your own paper doll-sized version of her cabinet, so you too can have your own Mrs. M's cabinet at home that you could print out and engage with yourself, which is actually kind of fun to do. I know this is a room that loves rooms. As a result of this interpretation, the result of this interpretation is a museum-based project that is both purposeful and open-ended, and we view those two goals as complementary at Chipstone. This intellectually capacious style is key to understanding Mrs. M's cabinet's pedagogical possibilities, and as I think about it in other contexts, also the feminist possibilities of a period room like this, a project like this. Because it's taking seriously alternative modes of history making, this project emphasizes the variety of stories that are available to curators, and it's open source. It's quite explicitly open source. The curatorial team, graduate students, artists, colleagues continue to work with us to develop Mrs. M's story through a variety of different kinds of research and making projects. And throughout, Mrs. M's cabinet uses the rhetoric of the historic interior to do this work. It allows us at the Chipstone Foundation to explore how history is told, who is allowed to tell it, what makes a story true, and how objects and domestic interiors can make multiple truths legible. My brief case study today only begins to share the interpretive and programmatic initiatives happening in the cabinet. We often host historical salons in there, we bring in school groups, we often have performances, and there actually are a few artists currently making work for Mrs. M. 18 months into this project, her cabinet has unexpectedly become Chipstone's primary changing gallery, one which we curate along with an historical character interested in object-based research and the cultural and ethical stakes of doing history in an art museum. The cabinet both illustrates and facilitates the creation of new historical interpretations that shape the way we teach with and through the time-traveling historic objects in all of our museum collections. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in today's event. It's been really inspiring and interesting, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute my story. When I was a kid, my family lived in a split-level house, a suburban house. Beneath the stairs was a storage area that we called the cubbyhole, where I would squirrel myself away as the middle child and play. On the sides of boxes, I drew the switches and instruments of a space shuttle flight deck using manuals such as this. And pushing those buttons and observing those instruments, I pretended a future escaping the Earth and flying back home. The cubbyhole's cramped dimensions and dim lighting helped me forget where I was, and awareness of time and the calls of siblings and parents faded away. I had no idea then that I was not alone in my efforts to imagine flight from inside the home. In fact, at almost the same time, around 1980, a computer engineer and entrepreneur named Bruce Artwick released the first flight simulator program for home computers, opening the door to a mass market culture of virtual aviation. His first experiments also led to the construction of innumerable cockpit facsimiles, some indistinguishable, as we'll see, from their Boeing and Airbus counterparts, in basements and bedrooms around the world. During the next few minutes, I'd like to explore how aviation enthusiasts and real-life pilots have created spaces in the home to simulate flight. In keeping with our theme today, I will pay particular attention to the work these spaces do to immerse their occupants and users in imagined worlds and how these simulators fit within past and current understandings of the home. Within a few years of the Wright brothers' success at Kitty Hawk, aviators were seeking ways to teach and practice flight under controlled conditions. As would be the case throughout flight simulation history, the military often led the way. William Ruggles' 1917 Orientator acclimated trainees to the sensation of moving through the air in any direction relative to the horizon. It featured a rudimentary cockpit set upon a gimbal that could also be controlled from a ground-based instructor station. So both the pilot, the trainee pilot, and the instructor could both control this simulator. A more influential design was Edwin Link's Link Trainer, a cockpit supported atop a compressed air bellows adapted from his father's organ factory in Binghamton, New York. Regularly improved and its capabilities expanded, the Link Trainer was credited with reducing the time that it took pilots to become ready for instrument training, and was adapted and used by almost all of the different air forces that participated in World War II on both sides of the conflict. With the explosive growth of passenger flight after the war, the rise of larger and more complicated aircraft, and acute shortage of pilots, commercial aviation also pushed advancements in flight simulation. But these civil and military simulators were all located on military bases and at airline training centers. In 1958, Popular Mechanics featured 18-year-old Jimmy Holden and his 4 classmates who constructed a simulator in the basement of Holden's suburban Seattle house. The group wired together donated and salvaged equipment in a close enough model of a 4-engine turboprop plane to be able to recreate all of the procedures that a real-life pilot would encounter or would engage in, from radioing the tower, taxiing, navigating, flying through the air, all in real time, and all the way down to landing and returning back to the airport. A decade later, the same magazine, Popular Mechanics, featured a home flight simulator invented by another individual from Seattle, physician William Duncan. It used compressed air from an old paint compressor, along with a complicated arrangement of surgical tubing and fish aquarium valves to drive the cockpit instruments. So this is Dr. Duncan with his son in the pilot's seat. He's behind with this apparatus that would allow him to trace the route, the trajectory that his son was flying on a sectional map, on an aerial map. He was a general aviation pilot himself, and he hoped to get his children interested in flying. He was successful. Some of his children did become pilots themselves, but he also packaged this as a kit and sold it as a DIY instructional guide, and according to his family, sold several thousand of these by mail. In the 1960s and 70s, a few companies developed consumer-oriented simulator packages powered by solid-state electronics. Advertisements positioned the ATC 510 explicitly within the domestic realm, likening it to the size of a television and photographing it among books in a home study. Yet it was only in the 1980s that flight simulation expanded its purchase in popular culture and the home, evolving from a training mechanism almost exclusively for pilots to be and for trainees, to a form of entertainment for those interested in aviation, but might not have any intention of flying an actual Cessna or a 747, either through financial restrictions, health considerations, and so on, or age. The primary technological developments that made this shift possible were the personal computer and the consumer flight simulation software. Bruce Artwick's flight simulator attracted the attention of Bill Gates, and his new company, Microsoft, began a collaboration with Artwick. In 1983, Microsoft released their first version of the program for PCs. By showcasing the processing and graphic power of the personal computer, as illustrated in this image, Microsoft hoped Flight Simulator would stimulate consumer acceptance of and demand for home computers at a time when most saw them as office equipment. Over the next 25 years and 12 iterations, Flight Simulator became one of Microsoft's most popular titles, selling over 10 million copies. Today, 3 companies dominate the consumer flight sim market. They're joined by hundreds of third-party add-on software companies and the manufacturers of peripherals, so the joysticks and the rudder pedals and various other components that can be incorporated into this. So, as you can see from the latest iteration of X-Plane 11, which came out earlier this year, the graphic capabilities of computers have expanded exponentially, and the ability to recreate these environments for the virtual pilots has expanded correspondingly. Many home simulators go no further than to add to their desk a joystick or maybe some rudder pedals or a second monitor. Even a few peripherals provide a more enriched tactile experience of taking off, navigating, and landing than just a keyboard and mouse alone. But I'm especially interested in the more elaborate setups that substantially transform the character of the space in which they're located. These flight decks may include plug-and-play components that are purchased off the shelf, or homemade versions with switches, knobs, and displays obtained from retailers and then wired to microprocessors that then translate the signals into the flight simulator, and then the flight simulator responds by moving the scenery around and so on. Or they might adapt instruments and controls salvaged from actual decommissioned aircrafts like the teenager Holden did back in the 1950s, although he had no simulator software or PC, of course, to hook it up to. Their experience as flight simulators was entirely tactile and contained within the cockpit. There was no representation of the landscape or the scenery through which they were flying. Home flight decks can be found in just about every space within the domestic space. Bedrooms, occupied or spare, and finished and unfinished basements are perhaps the most common. I've seen others situated in garages or dedicated backyard sheds. Less frequent are living rooms, particularly in multi-member households, where the location of these always has to be negotiated, and alcoves within the kitchen. The integration of the flight simulator and the home, the dynamic of being simultaneously in the dwelling and apart from it, is an essential element of simming's appeal. A New York Times article profiling the hobby describes a simulated night flight over Connecticut and the virtual pilot's anxiety about whether to press on or stop for refueling. Instead, the author writes, quote, "I hit pause and get up from my desk and head to the kitchen for a sandwich." Wherever its location within the dwelling, simmers often take steps to modify the space in a way that facilitates the sense of immersion and isolation from the room in which it's located. The easiest means to achieve this is simply to turn off the lights and just let the illumination from the controls and from the monitors provide that experience. Fiberboard panels framed with PVC pipes suffice for some. Others construct a space that mirrors the exact contours of the cockpit that they're imagining flying. Simmers interviewed for this project agreed that creating some type of enclosure was an essential step in enhancing their sense of immersion. One remarked, "Nothing wrecks immersion like looking up from a landing and seeing your washer, dryer, and your laundry detergent." Peak immersion is equivalent to what theorists call flow state or the zone, a combination of focus, empowerment, and pleasure. One cockpit builder said the outward evidence of such immersion, confirming that his simulator has gotten as exact and as realistic as possible, was that his invited co-pilots would get airsick, would become nauseous. The home simulator cockpit is a space that embodies a series of contradictions. It is both stable and precarious, fictional and real, ephemeral and enduring. Thomas Harvainen, his insights about how players construct a play space within the real world during live action role-playing games can be applied to home flight simulation. The players that he studies deploy various strategies to, quote, minimize disturbances to the illusion of play and to preserve the boundaries of the game. According to Harvainen, the blunting rejection of unwelcome information is extensively utilized, often instinctively, especially by strongly immersed players, to protect them from potential content that would be disruptive and situationally non-relevant. So the creation of these capsules, these cockpits, and their location within a room in these enclosures is essential to this process of weeding out information and sensory experiences and so on that don't contribute to the illusion of flight. Yet any membrane separating simulation from the world outside remains permeable. Life, social conditions, and larger cultural ideas work their way into the experience, sometimes insidiously, sometimes invited. The flight simmer might be imagined as a solitary tinkerer, frivolously spending time and money pretending in a darkened basement. This characterization, though, says much about the ambivalence Americans have long felt about play in general and digital play in particular. But flight simulation is both surprisingly communal and well aligned with age-old expectations for the worthwhile use of free time within the home. Many virtual pilots connect to online networks where they interact with other pilot simmers and a cohort of virtual air traffic controllers. This was a screen grab from this morning from a network called IVAO. I forget what it means, but these are actual flight simulation pilots. At 7 o'clock this morning, I grabbed this from my hotel room, and each one of the planes represents somebody around the world sitting in their cockpit or at their desk, flying a little plane, and being controlled in the best case scenarios by virtual air traffic controllers. You can see which networks are online here by these hatched areas. Europe, it was later in the day in Europe, so there are many more controllers online in that part of the world and many more planes also active. There were 631 pilots today and 44 controllers on the line, online. They also participate in online forums like cockpitbuilders.com, attend conferences and workshops, and post to message boards and Reddit subs and so on, sharing the frustrations and successes of constructing, modifying, and using their flight decks. Interview subjects regularly mention the importance of having friends and family serve as flight crew, imparting an enthusiasm for aviation, and partnering up for an evening trip to Paris or Hong Kong. Like the basement recreation room with ping pong table or home theater screen, the flight simulator is a modern hearth around which family and friends gather for shared experience, for relaxation, and for play. The simulator constitutes a social environment that structures the meaning of these activities and these spaces. As with other types of home-based recreation, flight simulation accommodates the twin views of the home as a place of both refuge and relaxation, and a place for hobbies that foster earnest self-improvement. They enable escape to just about any airport in the world, some that no longer exist. In Hong Kong, for example, Meigs Field in Chicago. They also reenact historic flights. You can download a model of the Spirit of St. Louis and recreate Lindbergh's flight. There's all kinds of airplanes that are no longer around or are very rare. Flight simmers also build scenery themselves and contribute them to a shared, publicly accessible gateway. So this is actually Logan Airport that was designed and donated as freeware for anybody that's flying X-plane. And you can get down and see all the cracks in the runway and all the rest of this. They also design planes themselves and attempt to accurately model the flight characteristics of that and those and so on. Home flight simulators expand their knowledge of aerodynamics, meteorology, navigation, radio communication procedures, and so on. They develop woodworking, 3D printing, electronics, wiring, and programming skills. When simulated flying or work on the cockpit produces produces and engenders flow, it also reinforces traditional understandings of the role of home and hobby as refuge and as restorative. The flight deck then shares a spot within the dwelling parallel to that of the home workshop, the woodworking workshop, the practice room for musical instruments, the sewing room, or even just spaces within the interior reserved for those activities. These are all spaces of productive pastimes, personal growth, and creative escape from the pressures of the world outside. Scholars have focused on the social and psychological boundaries of play and the representation of space within the computer game, but have paid considerably less attention to the physical site where play takes place. A predominant and contentious characterization of this zone is the magic circle, introduced by Johann Huizinga and later elaborated upon by Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen. He sees the magic circle as a temporary world within the ordinary world. The flight sim cockpit resembles the card tables, the tennis courts, and theater stages that he considers playgrounds characterized by order. Into an imperfect world and into the confusion of life, play and playgrounds bring a, quote, temporary, a limited perfection. Because they are part of and apart from ordinary home life, and because they are sites of play, simming cockpits can be useful lenses through which to view considerations of the domestic realm. Jaco Stenros says that, quote, play helps us perceive things from alternative angles and in a different light. It helps us engage with our surroundings in new ways as we perceive and break norms and routines. He continues, play and games serve as an alibi. As they are perceived as being somehow less, we can get away with more. Flight simulators look forward. They anticipate each new technological development. In simulator design as steps towards either ever-enhanced immersive experiences. New practices and tools, especially virtual reality, will no doubt continue to change how flight simulation engages the spaces where it occurs. While the presence of a high-tech 737 cockpit within a bedroom or a basement might seem out of place or incongruous, while it might seem like a jarring tear in the domestic realm, and while it might seem like just a kid or a play space for kids in cubbyholes, the way that flight simulators reinforce established notions of recreation and the appropriate use of free time within them is wholly fitting. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful papers. It was really a pleasure to hear all the different ways in which you are trying to bring into a room another reality. And as I was listening to the three of you, I had two ideas in my mind. And one is, as Laura said, keeping in mind the philosophy chamber, when we start discussing about the display of the philosophy chamber and how to go about that, we couldn't stop thinking that the real philosophy chamber and the real Harbor Hall is still in campus. So how would we negotiate that situation that we have the real thing there, the real space that we are now trying to recreate in a new building within a museum context? But the other question that prompted me your different approaches is about this idea of enclosure and inhabiting a different world, recreating a different world. And as I was listening to that, I was thinking about you're trying different strategies to do that, to create a virtual reality. But the way technology goes nowadays is that you can, by just wearing one of those 3D helmets, you would be immediately in a different space. And the one thing that the three of your papers, to my thinking, share is how the space, the room, the actual space is so strongly linked, even though you're trying to create a different reality. So just bringing back the question that Louis Nelson was addressing us yesterday, why the room matters. Would you think that you could be able to achieve the same goals that you are trying in your different proposals just by using a helmet? I mean, like, would Cockpit would still be a cockpit without having all your joysticks and all these things in the same room, just by wearing them? Or would you just be able to recreate Mrs. M's character and cabinet by using complete 3D reality? Or no?
I would say no. I think part of what makes Mrs. M's cabinet interesting for us is that it's a space that one can walk into, you can sit down, you can look closely at things, you can engage with the objects on display. And for us, one of our key purposes in creating that space was to display our historic objects. And so while those objects are available online, I think there is something meaningful about having the historical material things, the 17th century objects that we collect, on display for you to look at and think about in a different kind of context. And so I think there's something quite special about walking into that space, about feeling confused. In a way, like, where am I? What's going on here? What are connections that I can make between these objects and the space? What are connections that I can make between the space and the gallery before it, which was also a gallery we created, which is quite purposely. It's actually our Cosmos gallery, which is constellation themed, and it has a very, very cool lighting. It feels very 2001 Space Odyssey, kind of the opposite of Mrs. M's cabinet, a contrast that's purposeful. So I think there's something that is very physical and very embodied that's necessary for that space maybe to work. People can touch and look closely and sit down, and it feels different. Plus, we've worked with many craftspeople to create that space. I mean, almost everything in there is handmade, which is one of the beauties of working in Milwaukee. We have amazing craftspeople who we could work with on that project. So that's part of it, too.
Okay.
I would say, in answer to the question about simulation, it depends on what the person going in is looking for. If they are just trying to recreate sort of the experience of flight on a certain level, you can see the scenery, you can move around with one of these VR helmets in a way that you can't do now, and it's kind of awkward to look into a monitor or something that's small and see what you want to be seeing in every direction. And when you have those helmets on, you can't do that. But the people that I was looking at that are more involved in building these apparatus, and they're debating this issue too. A lot of them were originally sort of scared by seeing this technology that might come and supplant something that they've spent hundreds or thousands of hours building. And I think there was some concern about that. But it comes down to sort of what Sarah was saying about the tactility of these, the opportunity to touch things, and the importance of the feel of it. Right? Many of these people go to enormous lengths to find these parts. They love how they smell. They love how they look old. They love that they actually flew for thousands of hours around the world, and now they've had this sort of second life in their home. And you can't replace that using VR yet. Maybe there'll be a time where you actually get some sort of response from those controllers, but right now it's still at a pretty clumsy stage from my limited understanding of the actual contact with it. And there is also that sense of a shared experience that you don't get when you're in the VR environment, right? As I mentioned in the talk, it's really important to a lot of them to have that second seat and to have that be a space where somebody else can come in and share this as a shared experience.
That's important to know. Would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in a way the kind of function that Nelson imagined could only exist in a virtual representation, which I almost take that axonometric drawing to be, and particularly the kind of hovering, sort of decorporealized viewer of such a thing, in which you're sort of floating above a kind of rotating imagination of space. I would be very curious to know what it would have been like if that space had actually been attempted to be built, because I imagine it would be a lot messier and stranger even than that drawing suggests. And so later in his career, this is early on in his career, but when he gets past his sort of experimental projects and builds buildings, he's actually much more concerned with these sort of material properties of the building and the effect that they have on the human body. So at Saint-Lô, the hospital whose surgery room I showed at the end, he's using, he has Léger make a mural, he's using color on the wall as a way of thinking about the color's effect on the body and on the sort of mood of the patients. And so I think he's much more attentive to haptic experience than the sort of diagram would suggest that he was.
Okay, good. So you all agree. Does anybody have any questions? Want to? Yes, Mongo?
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on that thread of the sort of sociability, which struck me very powerfully. And just particularly think of Mrs. M's space. Of course, notably, she's not there.
Okay.
And yet one of the wonderful experiences of going into a space put together by a private collector is the enthusiasm with which the private collector will do something that none of us who work in museums will ever do. They'll go up to a shelf and pick up an object and say, look, can you feel that? Just turn it over, and all the rest of it. And I'm just wondering how you have negotiated yourselves through that bit that our professional existence just won't let us do, and in fact, how you negotiate your way through the inevitability of Mrs. M's absence, even if she's there in that little recreation.
It's a great question. In a very practical way, at the end of her Pepper's Ghost Illusion, she explains that she's in Mexico hunting for rare red wares, which is something that we're actually thinking of adding to the space. And so that's where she is when you visit the cabinet. But it depends on who we're with. I spend a lot of time in Mrs. M's cabinet on the weekends, pushing the stroller. People don't assume I'm the curator. I'm observing, I'm listening, asking questions. So I'm often in that space undercover, trying to understand how people are engaging with it, asking questions, listening, and that adds to various edits and revisions in the cabinet. But when I'm in there as the curator, or as a curator who collaborates with Mrs. M, as I often introduce myself, like, oh yes, we're working with Mrs. M, she's this person that sometimes I'll admit that we've created her, sometimes I won't. It's a game that my colleagues and I play to sort of think through, depending on who we're with in the space. But we often find ourselves talking about how spaces can tell stories. Like, what can you learn about Mrs. M just from this cabinet that I'm not telling you? You can look at her work, you can pick up her calling card, you can look at the books on her shelf. We have various things hidden in this space, what I guess video gamers would call like Easter eggs. They're things that you can engage with in the space that we don't tell people about, that they can find one of those books, you pull it off the shelf, it actually begins a secret program inside of the wall that one of my students created, where you peer inside and you see sort of another narrative that starts up. There are bells that you can ring that will maybe bring Mrs. M, maybe she will come downstairs, maybe she won't. So we leave lots of clues in that space. And so there's an element of a mystery, an element of a story, but not one with a clear beginning or a clear end. So she is a presence in the space, and one that we engage with in lots of different kinds of playful ways. But you can always pick up her calling card and you can go read her log and learn more about her that way. That's a good one.
Thank you for all of your presentations. I've been thinking about Mrs. M's cabinet constantly since you presented, because I can't help but having a comparison in my mind with other models that play with authenticity and fictionality, like Mrs. M's cabinet, but in a different realm, maybe entertainment in particular. I just finished a book by Shercrow's Knight about Disney World, and she talks about exactly like this, being into the characters. This is an art historian that discusses Disney World as an art history, through an art historical filter. And she talks about the fact that the actors and actresses that participate in that realm are not supposed to go out of character, just like you're not going out of character when you are in the context of the room, and the visitors participate in the stories, are familiar with the stories of the characters that are supposed to inhabit the spaces in that fictional construction. So there is, in fact, an idea of like even going to Disney World as a way of going to a pilgrimage site, as going to a place that can recreate a connection with stories that we're used to. So what I am curious about is the reception of Mrs. M's cabinet beyond the structured exercises that you can construct with graduate students or with specific groups of visitors, because I'm thinking about the context, the experiential context in which the typical 21st century visitor can immerse herself. The visitor that comes to that room will have in mind the Walt Disney World, most likely Walt Disney World's model, will have in mind a different kind of recreational model that functions in a way that is a lot more static and less authentic, maybe in different ways at least, than what you're trying to propose. So is there a confusion between, like for the viewer, this is a fictional space or is it not? And if not, how do you signal that it's not a fictional space?
Well, I think there probably is a little bit of confusion, and I, both pedagogically as a professor and as a curator, I don't think confusion is always a bad thing. I think it can often be extremely productive. And so oftentimes, as long as it's not frustrating, but I think a little bit of confusion can be a wonderful thing. So oftentimes visitors will come in and like, what is this place? To look around. They might, hopefully will pull the cord, and then the story begins. If they don't pull the cord, if they don't engage, if they don't page through the careful ledger books that we've put together, they often just think, oh, this is a period room, or oh, this is a really lovely space, or oh, this is interesting. It's also a place where they can sit down. Oddly, in the museum in which we're located, there are very few places to sit down. So it's a comfortable place to spend time. People are often in there sitting, talking. The security guards at the art museum are always hanging out in Mrs. M's cabinet, which I take as a very good sign.
Yeah.
It's a good place just to kind of, it has a very good feeling to it. So people are often spending time when they're looking closely at things, paging through ledger books. But if they don't choose to engage, there's no one telling them, this is what is happening in this space. And if you look at how people engage with most museum galleries, if you don't read the labels, if you don't actually engage with objects, there's no one telling you, this is what is happening in this space. You're making assumptions based on, a history of visiting museums. And so we're not prescriptive in that way. It's not as if you walk in, there's someone saying, you are now entering a period room created by the Chipstone Foundation who are interested in museum subjectivity. That doesn't happen. Like you walk in, you're like, oh, this is kind of cool. You can sit down, you can read, you can engage. And so that's what happens. So it works on multiple levels. It works on a level, hopefully, for visitors. It also works on a different kind of level for graduate students and for people interested in critical museum pedagogy and practice, as I think many of us are. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can have one more question. Maybe there, the gentleman there, that's not yet.
I'm really kind of curious about all of these spaces that actually we've talked about today have a sort of this convenient fiction that they express somehow, and the redemptive qualities of participating in that. It's kind of part of the story. But I'm kind of curious about the inconvenient parts of creating these spaces. I was wondering if you could comment on that. Doing the research, actually physically making them, and the kinds of tasks that are involved.
Sure. It's a great question, and it's one that came up a lot in my research because I frame it in terms of the sitting down and flying, but for many of the people that are engaging in this hobby, the building of that and the rebuilding of that is really the hobby that is more important to them than the actual flying, and they often say that they don't even get to fly, and they're often not in a condition where they can because things are taken apart and moved around. So it's similar to model railroaders who also build these in their basements and in many of the same sorts of spaces that will build it and then not even complete it and actually may not even really run it, but will get to a point where they lose interest or they've found something new that they want to model and will tear it apart and rebuild it again. So this process is, I think, really an essential and important part. The other important part of the hobby, the other component of that is that of the sort of inconvenience of these things is, as I alluded to, these are often in co-occupied spaces where they have to be negotiated. So I didn't include a slide, but there's one that was posted on Reddit of these of a couple, and he has a cockpit that he built that folds into a trunk. And then it sort of expands like a transformer, and monitors pop up and the doors pop open. And he said it had to, I forget what the criteria was, but it had to essentially not look like what it was. And it could fold into this piece of furniture. And it was in the same room, a spare bedroom in the home that he shares with his wife, who has a sewing space right next to his. Wow. And so, yeah, there's definitely some inconvenience in smaller spaces where multiple people live, and these have to be negotiated.
Sure. I mean, I think the inconvenience faced in studying, I think, a room that never existed is kind of, it's both convenient and inconvenient, because I can project, to use the word I was using a lot, anything I want on it, because it only really exists in my imagination. But it exists in the sort of representational fiction. But I do think there is a way in which the kind of deferred, the sort of deferred desire to sort of visit a space can be a kind of inconvenience, because this book kind of elicits this, I think, as you were saying, a kind of fantasy. It's quite a large book, and it has these incredibly detailed plans of heliotherapy baths, and where all the offices are, and where the furnaces are, and where the servants and where all the doctors live. And the whole sort of space is elaborated, and there's a kind of like melancholy, I think, to this elaboration that is never quite achieved, even in its kind of virtual representation.
Well, thank you very much. So we will reconvene here. Thank you very much for your contribution, for your questions. That has been an excellent conversation today, and we will reconvene here at 3:45 for final conclusions and remarks. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.